I was about 4 or 5 years old and my parents had just separated. My mom was living in a 2-bedroom apartment. I had my own room, but I preferred to sleep in her bed whenever I was staying with her. Our 2 bedrooms were at the end of a hallway, directly across from each other. Our apartment was on the first floor, and I remember that it was in the middle of the summer and my mom had a window open in her room, which was directly behind the bed, above the headboard. Anyway, I woke up in the middle of the night and remember sitting up and seeing that our cat was sitting in the door frame of my mom's room. Her door was open and you could partially see into my bedroom. This was strange because our cat was typically always in bed with us. As I was watching him, he walked into my bedroom and meowed. I turned to face my mom and wake her up. In the 3 or 4 seconds it took her to wake up and ask me what was wrong, we both looked back up in the door frame and there was a man standing by my open door, making his way out of my bedroom. I still don't know how she managed to do it so quickly, but my mother proceeded to pick me up and literally throw me out of the screen window. Again, we were on the first floor and it was maybe a 3-foot drop to the ground. She quickly followed and we were able to start screaming for help and someone called 911. The police came but didn't see any signs of forced entry. Only that our front door was unlocked, which led them to believe the man must have exited that way. The strange thing was that my mom swore up and down that she had locked the door that night, with the deadbolt and chain lock. About a week later she was cleaning the kitchen and opened up our water heater closet and found a notebook with names and drawings, as well as a pair of gloves and some gum wrappers. The police were called again, but all they could do was speculate that the man had been in our house and hid until we were asleep. I experienced this story when I was 12. I moved to my dad's when I was 10 and didn't know anyone in the area, except for the family my dad was friends with. Single mom with 3 kids. Luckily there was a girl a couple of years older than me, 12 at the time I met her, and we got to know each other a little over a couple of years. We weren't close, but ended up having the same friends. One night my friend Rob was hanging out with her and her younger brother. They happened to be in the house alone because my friend's mom was at work. This is where this gets terrifying and sad. Her mother has been helping this one lady through her work and got to know her fairly well. She found out her sister was in a mental institution and was let out recently. The night Rob is hanging out with my friend, they get a knock on the door. My friend thought it was just their mom. She knocks a certain way when coming in and answered it without thinking. Rob wasn't supposed to be there and he took off through the window to his house down the road. He never thought twice about it. Wasn't her mom. It was the sister of the lady her mom was helping, and she figured out through talking to her sister where her family lived and her mom's working schedule. She came in, and this is where I don't know details and I'm glad I don't. My friend's younger brother got away to the neighbors to call the police. The lady brutally murdered my friend a week from Christmas. Decapitated her and left her body, naked in a bathtub. Hid her head. They had to look through the presents and I don't know where they found it, but they did. I wasn't allowed to go to her funeral. There's an abandoned house next to mine. The previous owner moved out to California 25 years prior and never sold it. I got a flashlight, gloves, and pushed the window open, and went inside, starting with the basement. In the basement was a grand piano, still plays, but very much out of tune, old World War II stuff, what seemed to be a signed Elvis poster, and some other really cool things no one should ever leave behind. There's basically a whole story in that basement, including a broken wedding picture frame and instruments everywhere. On the main floor was an unmade bed, molded food still in the fridge, and on the stovetop, half-empty beers turned solid, lights that still hadn't been turned off. Then I started walking upstairs when I heard crying from one of the side rooms. That's when I freaked the F out and haven't been there since. This is a story my dad told me many times. In 1966, when my dad was little, around 13 to 14 years old, he began reading what I like to call no-no books. Black magic type evil books. One night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, my dad got up to use the restroom. When he came out of the bathroom, he heard what sounded like whispers coming from his room. At first, He thought it may have been my grandparents talking in their room. But as he sat and listened, he noticed it was coming from the opposite side of the room from where his parents' room would have been. My dad finally pinpointed where it was coming from, the upper corner where the walls and ceiling meet. My dad told me he did not recognize the language the voices were speaking. He said it sounded like a dead language, one not spoken for 1,000 years. The voices also came through with a heavy hint of static, like an old radio station that was hardly in range. Freaked out, he called for my grandfather to come in there. My grandfather opened his door and froze. "Who's in here with you?" my grandfather asked. "I don't know," my dad said, pointing to the corner of the room. At this point, the whispers had evolved into normal speaking volume. My grandfather walked in and listened for a moment. "What have you been doing in here?" he asked my dad. Without speaking, my dad pointed to a book beside his bed. My grandfather, a pastor at their church, his face grew very pale. My grandfather grabbed the book with one hand and the cross he wore around his neck in the other. My dad and his walked into the living room. My grandfather built a little fire in their fireplace. At this point, my grandmother came out in her robe and asked, "What's going on?" "Don, my dad, I told you no TV this late." My grandfather looked at his wife in horror and said, "Honey, that's not the TV." Once the logs in the fireplace began to burn, my grandfather tossed the book inside and waited. Once the book began to catch fire, the voices turned to screams that rattled the windows. They lasted about 7 seconds before everything went silent. I asked my grandfather about this story. He would always cut me off and snap, "We do not talk about that night, period." My grandmother said pretty much the same thing, only nicer in her granny way. My dad had told me this story a dozen times and it always captivated me. What were those voices? What were they saying? Was my dad close to opening up some kind of portal? I don't know. But I do know he never picked up a no book again. When I was single, I ventured into the world of online dating and stumbled upon a guy named William. Our initial interaction seemed harmless enough as we exchanged messages, but one day things took a bizarre turn when we exchanged numbers and he initiated a call. During our conversation, he adopted an unsettling demeanor, referring to me as his pet and subjecting me to a weird intelligence test. Despite passing the test, his behavior grew increasingly strange. One particularly alarming proposition involved his desire for me to visit him and star in a homemade horror film, wherein he envisioned me as a belly dancer performing in scenes of a questionable nature, including a chilling scenario of bathing with him in a tub of fake, or so I'd hope, blood. His unsettling ideas even extended to plans to lure me into the woods to experiment with hypnosis using an emerald necklace. Feeling deeply unsettled, I made the decision to sever ties with him. As I went to his profile to block him from further contact, curiosity led me to go through his photos first. What I discovered only fueled my unease. He was a bald man adorned with tattoos, sporting eerie white contact lenses, and posing in unsettling scenarios, such as a, hopefully fake, blood-covered garage while wearing a ski mask. Without hesitation, I blocked him, hoping to leave this creepy encounter behind me. Years later, just when I thought I had escaped his eerie presence, fate threw an unexpected curveball. While I was driving home from the mall, a vehicle pulled up beside me. To my horror, it was William. His eerie grin and knowing wave sent shivers down my spine. I watched him as he sped off. The memory of our strange conversations and his eerie demeanor came flooding back to me. That night, I made sure all my doors were locked, and I double-checked the windows. I couldn't help but wonder what could have happened if I had agreed to meet him in person, but I was grateful for my instincts that led me to block him all those years ago. From that day on, I was more cautious about who I interacted with online, realizing that not everyone is who they seem to be.